keep the back and forth, in control, just so that we get to field quite a few questions. And finally, it would be great if you can switch on your camera when you're asking a question, just make this feel a bit more personal. So I don't see any hands yet, which is fantastic, because I've got a question. So Jake, we heard about this, the fact that we have a greater free will the further we look and plan ahead. And then we also heard about the benefits of acting and acting now. And I was wondering, how do these two modes of decision making play with each other in order for us to give us our sense of control in the world, as well as how does it allow us to create the world that we like to live in?
Sure. Okay. So just the easy question to kick off with. So I think it's actually an incredibly deep question. Thanks, Hanno. It's a question that I've thought long and hard about. Um, the reason is because we're, as you correctly pointed out, we're really quick decision makers, which impulsive, we're making decisions at the seat of our pants, and we'd need to learn to, let's say, trust some of that instinct. But at the end of the day, you're pointing out, well, if free will really only lives but the further out you go, the more free will you have, and the more you leave your decisions to trying to decide in the moment, the less it's more like driven by your emotional state. So how do these two balance out? And that's a brilliant question. So the way I've actually tried to come to terms with it is to recognize what causes our emotions. Because really, if we're saying our emotions give us a particular impetus to make a decision, we need to actually understand what causes our emotions. And the insight I got from a book called Crucial Conversations many years ago is that you have to understand a path to action. So the path to action is something that happens to you. When that thing happens to you, you feel in a particular way, and then you act out based on those feelings. But what they pointed out is you actually tell yourself a story. They left out the part that's left out, and it happens so quickly, is you tell yourself a story. So something happens to you, you tell yourself a story, and as a consequence of that story, you feel in a particular way and you act out. And really trying to dreams and aspirations, or with that long-term thinking further and further down the line, is we're trying to challenge our narratives. We're trying to challenge the built-in stories that we're carrying with us. We're trying to reshape what those are, reshape what our aspirations are. And by doing that, those stories, so something you see or hear something, that immediate story that you're telling yourself has now been changed because of the work that you've done in terms of the future thinking. That changes your emotional state, and that changes the way you act out. So in many respects, the rider has control over the elephant. If we use the Jonathan Haidt metaphor, the rider does have control of the elephant, but it's a little bit like this, It's not a direct control. It's not the reins of the elephant. What the rider does is he basically just helps the elephant see the world through a different lens, if that makes sense. And that's really what you're trying to do, is you're trying to actually create and shape those narratives that ultimately direct your life. And when you do that, that's the way it actually plays in. So your question's profound. But that's what I've come to understand, is that you only really have, from a conscious point of view, rational point of view, only really have control over those narratives, those stories that I suppose shape how we make decisions. And we only do that when we're not in such an emotional state. We're not like caught up in emotional angst or whatever the story is. And it's those times that we actually have the biggest ability to shape the way we do things. But sure, I don't even know if I fully answered your question. I think it is such a deep question that needs a lot more thought, but that's my gut.
No, I think that's fantastic. Shaping the narrative that's sort of underlying the quick decision making. That brings me to a follow-up question on this. If we have because we make these decisions quickly, the narrative shapes some of it. And then also we have these heuristics to help us deal with incomplete information when we make decisions. And you mentioned a story around how those heuristics can often lead us astray. And the way we use looking forward to deal with our narrative, how can we deal with those heuristics that might be incorrect?
Okay, so I'm assuming you're referring, the one anecdote I used in the story is effectively the way we use, I suppose, was projection.
Yes, exactly.
So somebody who we come across, we need to work with them. So we project onto them. So it's a heuristic. The projection is a heuristic. We project onto them a relationship, a stereotypical relationship that we've had, let's say, with somebody in the past. And now we know how to work with that person because we're pretending that they're that person. I think the way, from a narrative point of view, I suppose it's just gaining greater clarity as to what's going on. So if we understand our inner workings a little bit better, and that's what I was trying to get across with that story, the problem wasn't extending the trust when maybe the trust wasn't deserved. And it was basically, it was almost, we're just going to give you the trust. You haven't deserved the trust yet. We're going to give you the trust. There's no problem with that. I think the problem is just not being as consciously aware of what that implies. So if I just give somebody trust when it's not earned, then you need to, what it implies is, oh, well, there might be evidence that comes along over time. I'm now becoming aware that that heuristic that I use, that let's say that shortcut rule of thumb that I actually use to make that decision, that decision's wrong. It didn't have enough information. It could be wrong. Not that it is wrong, but it could be wrong. There's more information that comes along down the line. And you might then say to yourself, all right, given that that decision was made with insufficient information, when new information comes down the line, don't assume my previous guess was right. And I suppose in software terms, we do you need to do the same thing. You make like a simplifying assumption with your piece of software to make a decision. And then you see, oh, sure, but I'm getting terrible, like the software is not doing what it's supposed to. It's not delivering the value I wanted. That simplifying assumption is just wrong. I need to reevaluate. And you will be able to reevaluate if you basically said, well, it was a guess to begin with. And I'm okay with the fact that we're dealing with guesses. And I think a large part of what we do in the software world, we try and make guesses. But I think what we need to always hold ourselves and be honest about it is when we've guessed, it's based on what data, it's based on, is it just a feeling? And effectively, yeah, so Tom's calling it backtracking. So I think it's just a matter of just saying, all right, so I've made a bit of a guess. I've met this person. I don't really know who they are, but let's reevaluate. Let's just, when I see evidence to the contrary, reevaluate that, the projection that I did. And I think that's maybe a way to try and answer that. I'm not seeing any other hands going up.
Yeah, please feel free. So something else that I was wondering. Oh, I
Luke's
see
got his
we've got
hand
a
up.
question
Yeah.
from Luke. Fantastic. Please take it away, Luke.
I've got millions of questions, Jake, but thanks, Hanno and Jake. So just a thought that came to me when you guys were speaking, and also probably because I'm biased by the unit tests I've been writing maybe 10 minutes ago. Jake, why don't we have a set of psychology unit tests that we can run? Because like there are some dimensions to these emotions and to personalities and things like that. And I think those personality tests might be that, but I never thought of them as unit tests for people. But what would happen if we did that, or if we started thinking, just run some unit tests, see what happens, how people respond, and then I don't know, maybe that gives us some insight. What's your view on that? Maybe it's a crap idea, but
listen, I think maybe what you're saying is like almost a normalized set of, let's say, engagements or scenarios that each person has to step into and see how they respond. And then did they respond necessarily the best way they could have? and why didn't they respond as well as they could have? So I think that's maybe what you're suggesting. A way of doing that without it being as contrived as that, because I think human beings don't necessarily lend themselves to contrived scenarios. Maybe they could, it's worthwhile, and maybe that's part of some of training. Maybe you could actually have, awareness of our psychological states and training with that sort of awareness. And that might be an analogy, like a clear correlative analogy from how we work with software and how we work with people. But I think maybe just at the end of the day, I think when you look back at the day and there were interactions that you didn't think went as well as that they could have. Maybe you lost your temper. Maybe you were not paying attention when you should have been. I know that I do that all the time with my wife. She has to live with a husband who she doesn't even know when he's paying attention or not, because I struggle. My mind's on something else. And then you look back at the day and say, well, that wasn't really fair on my wife, not to listen to her when she's saying stuff. So I suppose it's just maybe the approach to take there is just look back at the end of the day, get into the habit of saying, well, where could I have done a bit better? And maybe those built into the day are all these tests that you're stepping up to. And I think you just need to be critical and say, well, how well did I manage those tests, and which ones did I fail?
Thanks, Jake.
I see that Arno is next on the list.
Yes, sorry, I was just busy typing jokes in the comment section. Yeah, so Jake, when I listened to the recording, and at the end, what you were saying is you talked about connectivity, and then how it ties in with the big 5 personality ranges, and that each one of those personality types, you sort of see them as a curve, and like putting you on a specific spectrum on that curve. And then what was pretty interesting to me is that you said having the personality puts you at a certain point, but then learning can take you either to the left and right hand side of it. Like through learning, you can actually move like to different points on that curve. But what I was wondering is actually imagine if you could learn and put yourself anywhere on the curve, then we would be back to the original statement, which was you can learn anything. So my question is,
your question.
What determines how far you can go to the left and the right?
Okay, so I'm going to. It's a great question. It's a fantastic question. I want you to think of that initial set point as like some sort of a pole in the ground, and actually, then you've got an elastic band, which you can actually then move, I suppose, your set point, or you can move, you can't move your set point so much, but you can adapt your personality to different scenarios. So you might actually be very introverted. So you could actually push yourself in certain like party situations to be a bit more extroverted so that you can gain a lot from the party, etc. But you've got to actually understand that there's almost this elastic band that is attached to how far you can move. And the more and more you try and move your character traits away from your set point, the more and more resistance there is. The elastic band pulls against that. So it becomes impossible for a person who's, let's say, a chronic introvert to become this raving extrovert. It's too hard. And in fact, I would say there's diminishing returns. There's an advantage to become slightly more extroverted, or maybe even quite a lot more extroverted in certain circumstances, but there's diminishing returns. So to get a little bit extra extroversion out of yourself, actually so much effort, and there's hardly any reward for that effort, that it just doesn't pay the dividends. So we can move around a bit, and the reason I didn't show it all the way is because of that elastic band, and that's the way to think about it. You can't fundamentally change who you are, like radically. That is, you do have this innate, or this, let's say, born with point in that normalized distribution. So you are anxious. Let's say a person is neurotic, or more neurotic than average. They suffer from anxiety. You can't just say to them, well, don't be anxious, don't be neurotic. I mean, like,
yeah,
Yeah, very nice, but it's like just not possible. You can train yourself to be less neurotic in certain circumstances. Okay, I know what this environment's like, and I know the people, and it's a safe place. I don't have to be so anxious when I'm like, in this environment. So you can actually move it to some extent, but you can't like all of a sudden change it totally.
Okay. I think it's also, there's like an interplay as well between the personalities. Like if you think about it, working in an actual team, like you get a whole different, whole list of type of people working together and sort of like collectively reasoning and working through problems. And I think actually what actually enforces that elastic band as well is the impact that they have on one another. Like if you think about like your last point where you were saying like it's sort of like the group also has an impact. So it's not only looking at like how far you can move in between, because technically it's like the impact that they have, like having like the full left-hand people on the other point of the spectrum.
So no, so that is absolutely profound, because what you're actually saying, and this is 100% right. How does nature, from an evolutionary point of view, solve the problem of this really complicated world? So the way it solves it is not by producing one superhuman. It produces lots of different humans in different areas with different strengths, personality traits that differ. And really the way and then what nature lets you do is it basically those people who are more suited to that scenario, they succeed. So actually by us working together and by us sharing concepts and actually having that group work and seeing a different perspective, I mean, that's a healthy political system. You've got people on the right and people on the left. Really, it's all about the dialogue. It's how do we connect and how do we share ideas and how do we share, let's say, fears and aspirations. That actually ultimately is what allows us to move forward in a productive way. It's having that dialogue and having people to see things differently. So very much that group collaborative approach is part of our ability to actually deal with difficult situations, and it's nature's way actually of solving the problem of the complexity of the world. The brilliant questions. Thanks, Hanno.
Cool. I see that Kent is next.
Cool. Thanks, Hanno. Thanks, Jake. Yeah, so my question goes along the lines of, Jake, as you were saying, we as people we have our emotions and our decision making. And my life growing up with sci-fi, I immediately have a distrust of any form of AI whatsoever, because I immediately expect the worst. So I guess my question goes along the line of, at what point do we as people have to start thinking alike an AI, as in going along just a purely logic heuristic, in order to be able to trust AI?
Okay.
And not have to rely on human choices and intervention.
So it's interesting. So one of the points I raise in the talk is that we've created AI in our image. So what do I mean by that? So if you actually look at a lot of the neural nets, what they've done is they've taken the human neural, let's say, model, and how all these interconnections and the weighting of the different, the impulses going down the different pathways, neural pathways. And they've almost tried to replicate that. And in that sense, they've recreated AI in our image, a simplified image, but it's an image nonetheless. And they're taking advantage of the way humans actually train themselves to think, etc. So in some respects, AI is certainly a lot of the learning processes or the learning algorithms produce. We're trying to mimic the way people's intelligence works, certainly in very narrow areas at the moment, which learning is really focused and narrow. We're not trying to really mimic general intelligence in the way we deal with problems generally. I think where your fear actually is correct about AI is it's a very different, let's say, being. It's a very different creation to the human creation. It's not vulnerable in the same way that we're vulnerable, because maybe you can just make a backup of the AI and just restore it at some later stage, and actually nothing's been lost. You can't just make a backup of a human being and restore it at, let's say, 50 years from now, and unless we can get the cryogenic stuff working. So the vulnerability that machines have. So large part of our decision making is because we're vulnerable. It's It's because we realize that we're mortal, that we are actually only here for a limited time. And that forms part of our decision making. And I think maybe part of the distrust of AI is it doesn't have the same, let's say, fallibilities. It doesn't have the same limitations as we do, and the same vulnerabilities as we do. And therefore, we second guess, like, the whole, we were talking about Russia, Ukraine, and America, and the Third World War, and nuclear, mutually assured destruction, and all of the rest of it. Well, AI might not suffer from that because maybe it's invulnerable. It stands apart. So maybe, well, the AI wouldn't mind pushing the button for the nuclear holocaust because it's not affected. Okay, and I think the deep distrust is that that asymmetry in the world, and I think that obviously does shape the way in which AI could evolve and could make decisions. And I think the deep distrust is because of that asymmetry. So I don't know if there's any easy way of getting around this. I know that Archie has done some really good thinking around the ethics of AI and how do we, I suppose, draw out the what is the form of that ethical, responsible AI, or ethical AI? What does the form of it take? I don't think there are any great solutions at the moment. And maybe only when AI, if we could simulate the vulnerability that the human, human individual has, and an AI suffers from that same vulnerability, in the same way we have its limitations, maybe then we could learn to trust in a way that's a profound trust and a deep, a vulnerability-based trust. Like, I'm making myself vulnerable and I'm trusting you because you're also vulnerable, etc. And if we don't have that symmetry, maybe we're not ever going to get there. I think right now where AI is, it's very much, let's say, algorithmically focused. It's not really, there's not a huge, it's making decisions in very limited realms. It's not making broad decisions. And that's what I was trying to get across. The general intelligence for those broad decisions, I'm not seeing coming about as yet. When that happens, we've got a big challenge. So the question that, the challenge I put for everybody is to try and dream of that future of where we can actually treat each other as equals. But what will that take? What are the missing ingredients that takes us to the point where we can treat each other as equals? Is it down Elon Musk's neural link approach, where there's a fusion with AI, the human brain and the AI are fused? Is that the logical path, or is it something else? But it's a brilliant question, Kent.
Cool, thanks, Jake.
Cool. Rampton, you have the mic.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Hanno. So my internet's kind of bad, so hopefully I haven't cut off. But my question, well, there was something you said towards the end of your video, Jake, and that was, if I got the quote correctly, giving up on the ability to decide is giving up on our humanity, which I found very interesting. It reminded me of something Viktor Frankl says in the book you mentioned in the beginning, and that's that you can take everything from man except his freedom, except his ability to choose or his attitude in any circumstance. But how far would you take that? I've been toying with this idea for a while, and I don't know how else to phrase it, but like big free will and small free will. It seems like we're in a time now where we're very on edge. Like, we're in the role where we try to play God instead of playing man. So it's like that decision in any circumstance, how big are those decisions? Is it an attitude, like what we choose in a circumstance, or is it literally playing God? So that's what I'm by, like, you know what I mean by big free will and small free will? Like, is it us waking up, making our bed in the morning, like Jordan Peterson often says, or is it us deciding what the world has to do, or deciding, what the world should be, which seems like a lot of people think they know what is best for the world.
Cool. Okay, so above my pay grade question, I'm going to try. I think one of the things, again, a Jordan Peterson concept, or something that I heard from Jordan Peterson, is it's important to try and paint two pictures for yourself. the one picture you're trying to paint for yourself is your aspirational vision of who you could be if you make enough right decisions. And if you can, let's call that, that's a picture, you paint a picture of your little heaven. And then you paint a picture of your little hell, which is where you could descend if you've made enough bad decisions. And all of us know our own personal doom and where we could land up if those decisions, if enough bad decisions are made sequentially, one after the other. And then it's to recognize the fact that even those small decisions ultimately are take us either to our personal heaven or to our personal hell. So even some of those smaller decisions, which we think are inconsequential, actually take us down two different paths. So to some extent, I'm trying to maybe amplify even the small decisions are actually having big decision ramifications. Because if you know what you're trying to achieve, and you say, well, I'm lazy, I don't feel like getting up this morning. Well, where does that take you? That decision not getting up on time this morning to, let's say, do the bit of yoga that you wanted to do, does that take you to your personal heaven or your personal hell, that individual decision? So maybe it's not such a small decision because it takes you down a path which doesn't have small consequences, and certainly when you pile up enough bad decisions. So I think that's the one way of trying to answer that, is to recognize the bigness in even the small decisions. In terms of like the unqualified big decisions, we have to be conscious about, well, we're making this AI thing, right? We're making this new creation, which has awesome power, and it can have awesome power over time. Well, let's actually be more deliberate in thinking about, well, what does that imply? What it's to do what Archie's doing, which is, well, what are the ethics of that? Think about it. Like, in what way could this go wrong? Be a little bit more deliberate in not just saying, well, it's cool, therefore I'm going to do it. Actually say, yeah, it might be cool, but where does this go? Where does this lead? And do we want to live in that sort of a world? And maybe we do, but we just have to imagine what that world looks like when it's working, and when everyone's actually growing, and it's like the world's getting better. What does that look like, and what do we need to put in place in order to get there? So I think it's maybe the answer to the big decisions is actually, well, I don't think we can just abrogate our responsibility in the ethics of any of those big decisions. We can't just say, well, it's for somebody else to worry about. We're just working with the cool tech. I think we're having to think a little bit more deeply about, well, where does it lead, and what would we want it to look like if it can actually work? But I honestly believe that there might be better people who can answer your question better than I can, Ramson, because it's a hard one.
Can I just make one additional note? So you mentioned the heaven and hell concept. What is my personal heaven and hell? And it reminds me that when you speak of freedom, people often see freedom as the ability to do something. So freedom to, and they take for granted that there's also freedom from. So I might have the freedom to financial security, but I don't necessarily have the freedom from socioeconomic insecurity. Right. And a lot of people think, okay, now it's just me, freedom to just me, right? But then freedom from involves other things too. And what you're saying about the ethics of AI, it seems like that's all that people are concerned about, is the freedom for the AI to do something. And they don't actually look at, and though they say they do, they don't look at the freedom from. What should it be free from, or, not free from, and that's our laws, supposedly. So in that sense,
awesome.
It's like,
I'm blown. That is beautiful. I love that.
Okay, yeah, so that's why I'm like, I've been playing with that idea a lot. And right now, as it stands, it's like AI is almost like Jonah in the belly of the whale, right? It's not interacting with everything, but it's kind of just like, it's protected almost. Like it doesn't have full reign on the world, like some Blade Runner dystopia. So if it leaves the comfort of the belly of the whale, like, what is it free from and what is it free to do? And I think that's the thing we can learn from AI, is like, what are we free from and what are we free to do? Like, is it just the freedom to accept the circumstances, or should we have the freedom to manipulate the circumstances? I don't know if you have.
Yeah, we don't have freedom from the responsibilities that this technology the consequences of the technologies. So I think we need to say, well, we don't have freedom from worrying about that. And so that's what I'm taking from your comment, is that actually there are ethical ramifications to a lot of the work we're doing, and let's not dismiss it.
Cool. Thanks, Jake.
All right. Yannis, you've had your hand up for a while.
All good. Thanks, Hanno. Thanks, Jake. Very thoughtful conversation. I think there's a lot of philosophy in the room, which is definitely challenging my thinking. Yeah, so I've got a couple of our team in the room here. We're about 8 or so. So I wouldn't lift them because everything is connected at the moment, but we've got a couple of people here. It's probably my question, Jake, is a follow-up from probably what Kent asked earlier. It is really, in your view, do you think it would be possible? So I just want to change the dynamic around. We're looking at a lot of the human interaction and the impact and how AI could affect us as humans. But I'm thinking just from the other perspective, would it be possible for AI to bridge that gap, do you think, to become, talking connectivity, talking learning, would it be possible, in your view, for it to bridge that gap? And if so, what is the current barrier in your view?
So, in other words, what's the barrier for it achieving general intelligence?
Correct.
Okay, so, I mean, that's what I was trying to grapple with in my talk. So I think so if we actually look at AI today, which is all about big data and curated data and labeled data in order to train it, I think what the connectivity, that's the learning side of things. The connectivity side of things, which is the seat of general intelligence, is also trained. And that's what I was, in terms of like the natural selection, there's a training process that happens there, which is one of actually, over effectively multiple millions of years, basically trying something out, trying to build an intelligence through the genetic sequencing, seeing that it's like suboptimal, killing it off, and then ones that work, so it has been an optimizing algorithm through natural selection in trying to create general intelligence, and general intelligence is being able to operate in a world where things aren't the data is not very well curated, and nuance and let's say exceptional circumstances are being thrown at us every single day. And so one way to short circuit it is if we could leverage that connectivity that actually underpins the human's ability to do general intelligence. I don't know I know that they've done quite a lot of work on protein folding. I know that Google actually won a prize for bringing us like a really good, let's say, a prediction of how a particular genetic sequence is going to produce which particular folded protein. So I know that they've been doing some of the work on that. And if let's assume that they got that close enough to a working solution, then you could take a genetic sequence, so to speak, predict the shape of the proteins, and therefore predict what other aspects are going to be turned on and off in the gene, and then actually ultimately build the brain, but electronically through with it, and mimic the connections that we actually have through a biological development. I think we're a long way from that. My personal feeling is that ain't going to happen anytime soon. So then the question is, well, how do you get to a general intelligence by bypassing that? And maybe the only way to get to it then is to actually have learning, let's say, across so many different areas and AI models for all these different areas in life, and then try and say, well, how do we piece all this stuff together? I don't know if that's so easy to do, because now you're putting in a whole lot of intelligence into the voting between the different AI algorithms, which one should be used when. I think what's missing is maybe a profound understanding of how human beings make decisions. There are a number of books on my reading list that I haven't gotten to yet. I'm very much influenced by Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning, where he talks about human beings have maps at different resolutions in the way that we confront the world. And we always either working at a particular, let's say, level of resolution. And then if that map is broken by something that happens, we step back into a different map, a higher level, maybe a coarser map, and we try and navigate there. And then if that's broken, then we step back higher still than that. And then sometimes our maps are just broken. And then when you have people who suffer from like PTSD, it's just because they've got no map anymore within which to understand their experiences. So it might well be that the way to get to general intelligence is to actually understand all of these maps. I know there's a book on that that I haven't read. It was recommended to me. Once I've read that, I might be able to have a slightly better handle on your question. But I think that's the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is, how do we get to general intelligence within AI? I don't know if there are. We're certainly not there yet. The question is, how do we get there? I think I'm unqualified, but I'm trying to read and I'm trying to understand, and love to hear your ideas how we could get there.
Yeah, no, I definitely don't have any ideas. But I do think again, it could be one of those decision points where it could be used for very positive. You know, if you think of someone who's gone through big trauma, and there's a way for that interface to help solve that big trauma through some interface in the human mind. You know, if there's ways that you can solve those kind of problems, which was not decisional by the individual, it was actually circumstantial from an outside perspective. You know,
so they've done some amazing research on psychedelics. I know that America actually, so to speak, banned psychedelics for a long time, but one of the most effective ways of treating PTSD and that trauma is using psychedelics. And I think the reason it's so effective is it creates all these different, and I'm not, okay, disclaimer, I'm not advising anybody on this call to take psychedelics. Okay, please. My wife won't even let me take psychedelics. But I think what it gives you the ability to actually just see, it just like creates these random connections in your mind. And you actually, sorry, Tom, which one would I recommend to Tom? But basically it creates like all these random connections, and it's those random connections that actually, when they reconfigure, they help you see past what's blocking you, or see a bigger scene in front of you, see a bigger vision. And I think to a large extent, human beings have used it. If you're looking at shamanistic cultures, the shaman, the tribal chief, whatever, the wise person in the tribe was inevitably the person with the ayahuasca and all the rest. But basically just seeing the world from a different perspective and trying to actually bring some sort of a different out-the-box thinking so that they can actually solve the problems in different ways. But I know that certainly if you're talking trauma, there's a lot of very positive studies that have been done on psychedelics as a way of overcoming trauma.
Thanks, Jake.
Okay, Rodney, take it away.
Thanks, guys. Hi, Jake. How's it going? I know we had this conversation a while ago. So mine is a little bit more not actually a question, but I watched a really interesting video about the prediction over the next 1,000 years, what AI can become at the end of the day. And back to, I think it was Hannes's question of getting to that singularity point where there's actually where AI actually gets surpasses us, was this, as you said, with Tesla's Neuralink, is actually not AI but IA that can get us there. There's intelligence augmentation, actually using machines to get perfect recall or perfect memory. And I think the step after that might be where we actually upload, where you get a mixture between human consciousness and AI that augments it into a kind of a this amalgamated thinking machine. But it was just interesting. I'll share the link with you guys as well about that video, and just how we try and solve for these planet machines that need power, like building Dyson spheres, and then even eventually they get to a point where they use the cooling, basically the expansion of the universe cooling to boost CPU power of these planets. So, but I'll share the link to you guys. And it was just an amazing kind of, thought process of where, we start now looking at, the future, and 1,000 years from now, we literally become space. Like space becomes our consciousness.
Sure.
But I'll share the link with you guys.
That's the sort of stuff that Peter Hamilton is one of my favorite science fiction writers. He talks about humanity spreading off in different directions, and one of those directions is exactly what you've described, which is it's science fiction. I think it's very hard for us to predict how it's going to unfold and if that's a viable future approach. But I think it's worthwhile us thinking about it. It's not just for science fiction purposes, but just say, like, this is where it could go. What are the ramifications? What are the downsides?
No, definitely.
And just, so I mean, I'd love to see that video. Thanks, Rodney.
Yeah, but I think the biggest thing on there was probably, once we get to that singularity point, is that our last invention? Is that the last thing that we create?
Well, the question is, who's we?
That's
if our children, if we consider AI as our silicon children, or as our, let's say, non-biological children, maybe there's a massive future ahead for, let's say, the progeny of the human race.
Yeah. But I've shared the link in here if you guys want to watch.
Right.
All right, Tasso.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I'm definitely going to watch that link, Rodney. I was wondering also more about the concerns that AI takeover, like Kent was saying. For me, it's like chasing perfection is an infinite game and impossible, whether you're human or not. It's having all the information while making the correct deductions for every case existent and non-existent. But do you think if the scope of AI was all-knowing, like you say, it's more targeted learning than it is general intelligence, where if it did have that scope, which I guess would be the singularity, that there would be potential for emotional intelligence contained as a subset? Or maybe the inverse would make more sense from the perspective of humans versus AI, is if humans became all-knowing, would that make our emotions more neutral?
Well, let me deal with the second part of your question. If humans became all-knowing, would it make our emotions more neutral? So I think that was, for me, the eye-opening thing of Antonio Damasio's book, is that our emotions are actually very much linked to our ability to function. We actually battle to make decisions without our emotions. And if you cut those off, we actually... So I think it's a mistake, or it's incorrect to think that our ability to make decisions is purely based on a whole bunch of information, because I think there's, almost by definition, there's not enough information in order to make good decisions, because we're confronted with new stuff all the time. And if you're going to wait for enough information to make the decision, then you're most probably going to be making bad decisions. And that's what I was trying to get across with my story about trying to hire somebody for a corporate. And we couldn't actually hire somebody because we were just trying to get enough information to make a good decision. And then you actually end up making a terrible decision, which is making no decision at all. So I don't think we're going to land up with a perfect world where we have enough information to make decisions with confidence. And I think an AI is going to have the same profound, let's say, disability, which is not enough information to make the best decision. And you're going to ultimately have to rely on a guess. Now, the question is, what is guiding that guess?
Yeah, it makes sense.
But yeah, so do I think there's an ultimate limit to how much AI could achieve? So I think a few things pop in my mind when I think there's an ultimate limit to knowing, and we know that from quantum mechanics in the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It's not that we can't measure things accurately enough, and there's a limit to how accurately. It's just that they don't have a measure at a certain, like, the Planck wavelength. You're not measuring stuff, okay? Or it doesn't exist until you measure it type idea. So there is a an upper limit on determinism, how much of the starting, let's say, starting states we can actually know in order to predict how things are going to turn out. And we actually don't know. So I think that's the one thing. I think there's an ultimate limit to there. I think the other thing which would be quite interesting is to understand how Gödel's uncertainty theorem about basically you can't fully describe any reasonably complex system by itself type idea. So there's always this having to describe something by jumping out of the system. To what extent that impacts, I don't know. I have to maybe read Roger Penrose's book, and I can't remember the name offhand, I think, where he tries to deal with that. But essentially, I do think that there's an upper limit to what AI can achieve. But I do think ultimately it will become, if you're thinking about intelligence in terms of IQ, it will have a higher IQ than humans, for sure. Will that mean that its decisions are perfect? No. And then it's going to be a trade-off. Well, and those trade-offs that it's trying to make, those decisions that are imperfect, to what extent are we impacted negatively? I don't know. So
I almost feel like it would decide just to exist instead of just decide.
Yeah, I think your questions are great. I just don't know if I can answer them. They just seem that.
Just chatting about it has given it a different context. I mean, even what you mentioned earlier on around psychedelics, if you consider humans having an ego death, they're also less prone to decision making, right? And that's also because of making certain neural connections that would be maybe equivalent of having a broad spectrum of knowledge in the first place.
Yeah.
So maybe AI wouldn't even be a concern because they wouldn't make decisions. They wouldn't need to. They just exist, right?
No, listen,
just thinking out loud.
We are asking them to make decisions on our behalf. And I think it's a good tool. It's like any other tool. We use a hammer because our hands just don't do the right thing with that nail. They get bloodied and sore. So we use tools, and we use them very effectively. And AI is just one of those tools that, instead of just disintermediating our muscles, it's also disintermediating our mind.
Yeah, to make better educated guesses than us.
Yeah. So, but they're still tools, and they're still effective tools, and I wouldn't want to discard them just because they're so effective. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't contemplate when, what are those boundaries? How do we interact? How do we work effectively with them without introducing too much risk going forward? These are hard questions that haven't been answered.
Thanks. I think Luke as well, before we run out of time.
Yeah, see, we've got 4 minutes left. Will that work for you, Luke?
Yes, I hope so, Jake. From the discussions, the idea that came to me about those time spans, if I was living 200 years ago in Poland as a potato farmer, my decisions around which potato should I, plant next, and the world worked a lot slower, I think, to some extent, whereas the technology world we live in now, things are moving exponentially. So isn't there value in acknowledging that we as humans have not been trained through evolution to deal with this pace of progress, and our decision making previously might have been, whether I decide yes or no is not really going to change the world as quickly as it might today. Whether we use electricity to mine Bitcoin could change global warming, or have some massive effects. And also there's 7 billion of us, so that multiplier is quite massive. So I'm just asking, shouldn't we first acknowledge that we've never been in this situation as humans, and that evolutionary optimization machine has not prepared us for this thing that we find ourselves in? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I actually admit it in my talk where I say, actually, are we prepared to listen to our intuition and our gut feeling in making decisions when we risk so much? And maybe it's not up to the task. Maybe our intuitions and gut feelings aren't up to the task in this case. And I think a large part of that not being up to the task is the pace at which things are happening. So I think what you're saying is 100% valid. We're not used to a world where the change happens at a rate that we cannot get our heads around. So 100%, we need to acknowledge that. And 100%, we need to acknowledge that maybe our puny little brains don't have enough neural capacity. I don't think it absolves us of the responsibility of trying. And I don't think it absolves us of the responsibility of actually making those decisions. I think we have to, and we have to engage. So just because it's getting hard might mean, well, then we need helpers. And so maybe AI is part of those helpers to help us actually conquer or get on top of some of the pace of change so we can understand it a bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe this is one of our helpers that can actually, we can actually use that to tame the pace of change and actually get a handle on it so we can make better decisions. But ultimately, I think to the extent that we say to the AI, all right, now then you make the decision, I think that's when we're starting to make mistakes.
But Jake, for me, that idea you just mentioned now has helped me allay my fears of AI, where you get blinded, just like, oh, then I don't want to do anything. It's like, well, use them as tools now to help us going forward. So yeah, it's a cool way to see it, to supercharge our current challenge. Yeah. Thanks. This was really, really awesome.
All right. I see that it's 2 o'clock. So I guess that would be the end of the session.
I'm happy to stick. If anybody wants to stick around and ask me a question, I'm happy to stick around. But I'm happy for people to leave as well. Don't feel that. I know everyone's got to get back to work, and so Stefan, I'm very happy to answer Stefan's question. Anybody else wants to ask questions and stuff, I'll stick around a bit.
Okay. I just want to jump the queue then, because I've got a question around. You said one way we can trust AI is if we give them the same weaknesses that we have. And Tom suggested maybe give them the ability to decay. And I was thinking, what would be the moral implication of creating something with the ability to suffer? And if we are these creators, is that similar to the problem of evil, giving them fear and death ultimately?
So if you want to get, I think it's a brilliant question. And if you want to get religious and theologically inclined and bent, well, maybe that's why God made us vulnerable ultimately, is, there are blessings, there's a book called Blessings of a Skin Knee, which are the blessings that come about because of, life throwing you challenges. One thing is it teaches you humility, it teaches you vulnerability, it teaches you to actually acknowledge the other in a very profound way. It's so to some extent, I do think that there might well be value in adding in that decay. I love the idea, but adding in that ability to actually say, well, we need to be able to give part of the shaping of the intelligence needs to be a level of, let's say, risk taking and risking your own life type idea in that. And are you prepared to actually make that decision, knowing that the consequence might be having your life, so to speak, cut short, or your consciousness cut short? Wow, I think there's a lot in there, and I think there's a lot of what, in terms of theologically, that we can learn in terms of the thinking, in a lot of, like, if you think about the religious thinkers and how they've seen evil and how they've seen challenge and how they've seen vulnerability and how that plays into, let's say, living an ethical life or living a life that's actually profound. And I do think that there's a connection. So, and I think maybe we're missing something vital by taking that away. There's some vital essence of being human that actually gets robbed of us if we do away with that. And maybe that's part of the challenge that we face as a society by embracing long-livedness or trying to solve the engineering problems associated with, like, having massive lifespans, is we might be fiddling with something fundamental in terms of our decision making and an imbalance in our decision making that is actually harmful, at a level that we can't really comprehend at the moment.
Okay. And just a quick follow-up. Would it be moral to create something with the ability to suffer, but not the ability to die? Like a neural net that
Sure.
could suffer?
I'll be honest, sure, I don't know. I mean, that's the big question, right? Is it
All right.
moral to create something that can suffer?
Ask the gods.
Yeah, exactly. Ask the gods. Wow.
Would we, like, I have a question on that.
Yeah.
Wouldn't we first need to define what suffering is before we can answer that?
100%. You'd also have to define, I suppose, what evil is. Although that's easier to define, I think. Much more difficult to define what good is. But yeah, I think like all of these things are important. This is exactly the thinking that we need to go through. What is it to suffer? And then is it ethical to create an AI that can suffer so that its thinking can be shaped by that? Can we create an AI that can do evil? Because maybe it's only then that it can do good, because it has, do we give it the ability to choose? These are deeply profound religious questions, or certainly a lot of religions have tried to grapple with this. And there are no ready and easy answers, but I think it's worthwhile thinking along these lines. Certainly when we're playing God and creating new creatures of AI, maybe we should actually be looking at, to some of our, let's say, ancient wisdom for new wisdom.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. Stefan, I'll hand over to you. Taking enough of your time.
Yeah, so it's a short question. Are we doing anything, is there part of synthesis that works towards advancing AI? And if not, are there other companies that are doing that, and how is it profitable? Like, which companies are working on that, and how is it profitable for those companies?
So you've got the intelligent data division, which is leveraging AI. So you asking, like, does synthesis work on the cutting edge of AI in order to develop the AI models? Or the AI, let's say, neural nets? No, we don't. A lot of that is actually, I would say, a lot of that is in the academic circles. How would you make it profitable? I thought you said it was going to be a short question, Stefan, but how would you make it profitable? Oh, my word. If you can get AI right, it's hugely profitable. But it's like any other startup. You have an idea, you need to get the idea. Then you need to see how that idea can actually profoundly impact the world, like through a 10x opportunity, and then chase it. Would we be willing to do it if we could actually get that idea? I think synthesis, that's part of our DNA, just stepping up to the massive challenges if they look compelling enough. Do we have the right people? Maybe. It might well be that we do. The question is, should we be doing it? And I don't know. That's going to be on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, good answer.
I think there was one more hand up. Sia.
Hey, Jake.
How's it here?
Great. Just so one of the things that sort of comes up whenever you sort of bring the topics of AI, especially within people that are not working in the industry, is the whole dystopia, of course, of saying, everything is just gonna go bad and things. And then, but when you think of it, and you think of from what we're doing, you can sort of see the huge value that's gonna come out of it. And I think now the question that comes from me is that since there's sort of this further understanding between the people that have never been into it and the people that are into it, are we sort of now, as software developers, or just as businesses that are actually working within an industry, to sort of make certain policy decisions that will help people in, like, life to sort of say, okay, fine, actually there is value that can come out of it. Or are we within a position where we actually have to say, you know what, we need to start knocking at people's doors and actually saying, hey guys, there's certain decisions that need to be made because there's an inevitability that's going to happen within just life. Or are we just leaving it to natural selection where, you know, we just say, AI will solve everything for us, you know, in as much as you say it's going to solve everything for us, will it also solve also the ramifications that we sort of see that are coming to some extent?
I would say you're hitting the real question you're hitting the question. This is the real question that we have to answer. I think we're in the same mode as the scientists in World War II who were developing the atomic bomb. Let's just do it because like we can, you know, we understand the physics, we understand we can do it. We need to get there first because we have to prevent other people getting there first. We need the power from it. But none of those scientists were really thinking, well, should we be doing it? And I remember one of my heroes is Richard Feynman. And Richard Feynman was part of the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb during World War II. And so he said initially, so why did he get into it? He got into it because actually he said there was a real fear that the Germans were going to develop the atomic bomb first. And if he didn't put his effort in, America wasn't going to get there first. And that could actually lead to the end of the free world. So he got into it. He was part of the team that developed the atomic bomb. He then, after they dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he went into a profound depression for many, many years. Profound depression. And he eventually came out of it. It took him a long time. He was convinced the world was going to come to an end, etc. And he said he regretted the following. He didn't regret being part of the project because he said at the time he had to be part of it. He regretted when Germany fell out of the war that he didn't step out of it. He said he got so caught up in producing the atomic bomb and in the goal of getting to the atomic bomb, he didn't reassess his decision and say, all of my reasons for getting in have changed. And actually, as soon as Germany dropped out of the war, I should have withdrawn. I should not have been part of it. And that he didn't forgive himself for. He's a profoundly honest person, profoundly deeply, let's say, intuitive person, Richard Feynman. Unbelievable. That's why he's one of my heroes. He said that he regretted. He regretted not thinking, why am I doing this? And I think that's my appeal to everybody. We can't ever say, let's not think about why are we doing this? What are the ramifications? What's the downside? Should I be doing this? And not, other words, I don't want any of us to live with the regrets that Richard Feynman lived with. So what are the right bodies? Well, I'm actually saying you, Sia, are the right body. Everybody in the call is the right body. We're the right bodies to be thinking about it. We're at the coalface. We're actually using this technology. And all I'm saying is let's hold ourselves accountable.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks, Jake.
Rampton, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, so just on that note, like, is there any use in even asking that question? I know earlier I was like asking that question myself, but like inevitably we're gonna do it, right? Like if the option comes to have nuclear bomb version 2.0, we're gonna create it, regardless of the ramifications. It's just I feel like everyone, even if they know the moral, again, like what is moral, right? But like if you know the outcomes, even if you know there's like 99%, like just that 1%, you'll press the button to create it, right? Whatever it is. So it's like, is there any use even asking that question? I know like everyone always says take accountability for your decisions, but it's like it's inevitable. Like we know some group of people, it's going to be done at some point. So
the only question you have to ask is,
question? Yeah.
The only question you have to ask is, does it have to be you? So if somebody's going to do it and someone's going to develop the Terminator to go back in time and wipe out the human race, does it have to be you?
But I think most of us in that position, I think most of us would, right?
Maybe.
You know,
That's what I'm. So I suppose my appeal is saying, well, let's use our human decision making, not make a decision and just say we're chasing after something because it's cool, but think, how can we shape it in such a way that we can work effectively with it? Is there a way? Just use our mind instead of just chasing mindlessly, saying, well, other people are going to chase it mindlessly. That doesn't excuse us for doing that same thing. Can we shape it in a way that actually profoundly makes a difference? That's all I'm saying. Is just think about that as well. Let's continue making those hard decisions and not letting machines make those decisions, or not letting the de facto with somebody else's problem. I don't have a perfect solution. All I'm asking is that we just be conscious of our decision making.
Yes, maybe the question isn't that, right? Because like we know the answer to that is yes, it's inevitable. So maybe the question is like, what can we do prior? It's like someone's going to jump out the window, right? Like it's not up to you. You're not the one pushing them, but like you could put the cushion at the bottom, you know, a mattress at the bottom. So it's like maybe that's the way of looking at it.
I think we've run over quite a bit. And thank you, everybody. Yeah, that was a great session. I really enjoyed it. Hanno, massive thank you to Hanno. I really, really appreciated you facilitating this meeting. It was brilliant. It was better than I could have imagined. And you were very much part of that. So thank you.
Thanks. And thanks for the session, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.